Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive into the life of William Wallace. You probably know him from Braveheart, the face paint, the whole deal. But we're going way beyond Hollywood in this deep dive. We're going to the thick of it with actual historical accounts, even a letter signed by the man himself.
And trust me, the reality is much more complicated than any movie could show. For instance, did you know some evidence even suggests Wallace might have thought for the English before becoming, well, a Scottish icon?
Okay, now that's a twist you don't hear every day. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before we jump into all that, what was going on in Scotland during Wallace's time, and what was the backdrop for all this?
So imagine Scotland in the late 1200s, total political turmoil. It all starts with the death of King Alexander III in 1286, his heir, his young granddaughter Margaret. Tragically, she dies on the journey to Scotland, and this is what sparks what historians call the Great Cause.
No clear heir to the throne. That's asking for trouble.
You can say that again. 13 claimants pop up, all wanting that throne. The two big contenders were John Balliol and Robert Bruce. Yeah, that Robert the Bruce, the one who eventually becomes king.
Okay, so things are already messy.
And, to make matters worse, this whole power vacuum. It gives King Edward I of England the perfect excuse to step in. Supposedly, as a neutral guy just trying to help, but, he was really more interested in expanding his own power.
Classic power grab. So where's our man William Wallace fit into all of this?
And that's where it gets interesting. We actually know very little about Wallace's early life. Historians still debate when he was even born, who his parents were.
Wait, we don't even know when he was born. I thought that was like basic history stuff.
You'd think so, right?
Huh?
One theory, based on a letter with his seal, says he was the son of some guy named Alan Wallace from Ayrshire. But then there's that super famous epic poem by Blind Harry, written like 200 years after Wallace died. Blind Harry claims Wallace's dad was a Sir Malcolm of Elderslie. Much more exciting, of course, but no real evidence for it.
Sounds like we should stick to the history books, not Hollywood, for this one.
Exactly. Even Wallace's name is a bit of a mystery. Wallace, it probably comes from Wylesc, meaning foreigner or Welshman in Old English. Might mean his family were immigrants, maybe even from Wales.
Foreigner turned national hero. History, you're right. But okay, you mentioned earlier that Wallace might have actually fought for Edward I. Now, how did that happen?
It's a good question. Historians have always wondered where Wallace got his military skills from, which, were pretty important later on. One theory is that he learned to fight as a young man in Edward's army, maybe even as an archer.
An archer. I always picture Wallace with that massive sword, like in Braveheart.
Right, that's mostly Blind Harry in Hollywood again. But there is one little clue that supports the whole archer idea. Wallace's own seal. It had an archer's symbol on it.
Okay, now that's a fascinating detail. So the guy who becomes a Scottish icon, he might have started out fighting for the English.
It really makes you think about how his life really went. What could have made him switch sides like that? And speaking of switching sides, have you heard about William de Heselrigge?
That name rings a bell. Wasn't he some English official?
He was. William de Heselrigge, the English High Sheriff of Lanark. And in 1297, Wallace kills him. That's when things really heat up in the Scottish resistance.
So Wallace was like the first spark, right? But the whole country is ready to explode.
Exactly. He wasn't alone either. Other rebellions were popping up all over Scotland, led by guys like William the Hardy and Andrew Moray. Just after the whole Heselrigge thing, Wallace teams up with William the Hardy, and they raid Scone.
Scone. That wasn't just some random town, was it?
No way. Scone was hugely important, very symbolic. For centuries, that's where Scottish kings were crowned.
So raiding Scone, that was like a direct attack on English authority, basically saying, we don't recognize your king.
Exactly. They were definitely sending a message. And remember, this is just one of many uprisings happening at the same time.
Yeah.
But for some reason, it's Wallace's name that everyone remembers.
Well, it could be his leadership in those early revolts. But if I had to guess, I'd say it's got something to do with his military victories, specifically the Battle of Stirling Bridge. You're probably right about that Stirling Bridge is legendary, even now. It really shows off Wallace's skills as a military leader, right?
Absolutely. Remember, the English army, led by John de Warenne, they massively outnumbered the Scots. They probably thought this would be an easy win. What they didn't expect was how the bridge would actually help the Scots.
Wallace and Andrew Moray, they used the bridge to their advantage.
Exactly. The bridge was narrow, so the English army got all bottlenecked trying to cross. The Scots could pick them off one by one before they even had a chance to really fight back.
Yeah.
Risky move, but it paid off big time. And get this, the bridge itself actually became a weapon.
Wait, you mean when it collapsed? That's crazy. What happened?
Well, there are a few different stories, but the most popular one says it was a few things combined. One, you had all those English soldiers trying to cross, so the weight was a problem. Two, the Scots timed their attack perfectly, put it all together, and boom, the bridge couldn't handle it. A bunch of English soldiers went right into the river below in full armor.
Can you imagine? Stuck in all that armor trying to stay afloat, and Scottish soldiers are waiting for you on the shore. Talk about a nightmare.
It was the victory for the Scots, totally demoralized the English. That's when Wallace really becomes the military genius, the guy who could outsmart and outmaneuver a much bigger army. And then there's what happened to Hugh de Cressingham, Edward III's treasurer in Scotland.
Oh, yeah, Cressingham. I've heard stories, not good ones.
Let's just say it wasn't pretty. There are different versions of what went down, but some say Wallace actually had a piece of Cressingham's skin made into a sword baldric.
That's brutal, even for medieval times. It really shows you how intense this whole thing was, how much hatred there was on both sides. This wasn't just about land or power, it was personal.
You got it. You're absolutely right. This was about freedom, identity, fighting back against oppression that runs deeper than just conquering land.
So after Stirling Bridge, this huge win, Wallace and Andrew Moray are appointed joint guardians of Scotland. They're basically running the country, right? But instead of King John Balliol, it's them in charge. This Guardian of Scotland title, what did that even mean back then? Was it like being king but with a different name?
It was more of a temporary thing, when there's a crisis or if the king can't rule for some reason. As guardians, they had the power, they defended the country, kept the law, and in this case, they had to keep fighting Edward I. It was a huge deal, and sadly, Andrew Moray didn't get to do it for long.
He died from what happened at Stirling Bridge, right? So then it's just Wallace, the only Guardian of Scotland.
Man, that's a lot of pressure for one guy, especially with Edward I out for revenge.
Yeah, it was a tall order, especially since Edward had zero plans of just letting this go. After Stirling Bridge, he was even more determined to crush the rebellion and make Scotland do whatever he wanted. Which brings us to the Battle of Falkirk in 1298. So what happened there?
Okay, so after Stirling Bridge, Edward I personally leads another invasion into Scotland. But this time, he's ready. He remembers what happened at the bridge, so he brings a lot more longbowmen. Bad news for the Scots.
This is where that saying comes in, right? Don't bring a spear to a longbow fight.
Pretty much. Those English longbowmen, they could shoot from so far away, and they were accurate. The Scottish schiltrons, those tight formations where they all stand together with their spears, totally vulnerable. Imagine all these warriors, shoulder to shoulder, spears pointing out like a giant wall of spikes. Great for fighting other soldiers up close, but against longbowmen from a distance. Sitting ducks.
And this time, there was no bridge to slow the English down, right? The Scots were totally exposed.
Exactly. Open battlefield at Falkirk, the English could just pick them off. The Scots fought hard, but they were totally outmatched. Falkirk was a crushing defeat for Wallace and a turning point in the war.
I bet that was demoralizing for Wallace and his men. But even after losing, the stories about how strong Wallace was, how he fought, they started spreading. He became a legend.
Yeah, exactly. There are stories about him just going crazy with his sword, cutting through English soldiers, holding them back so his guys could escape. We don't know if those are true, but they all added to his legend. Even in defeat, he was a symbol of resistance, proof that Scotland wouldn't give up.
So what did Wallace do after losing at Falkirk? Did he disappear? Or did he keep fighting?
He kept fighting, but not in the way you might think. He realized that to beat Edward, he needed more than just the Scottish people. He needed some powerful allies. And that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. Where does he go looking for these powerful allies?
He doesn't hide in the Highlands or on some island fortress. He sets sail for mainland Europe. He's on a mission, a diplomatic one.
He leaves Scotland. Now, that's not something you see every day in the history books. This shows he was more than just a fighter. He understood politics, the bigger picture.
Exactly. Wallace wasn't just some fearless warrior. He was a smart strategist, a diplomat. He knew that to beat Edward, he needed to get other countries on his side.
This trip to Europe, it's like a secret chapter in his life. Most people picture him always in Scotland fighting the English. What proof do we actually have that this even happened? This trip to Europe, it's like a secret chapter in his life. Most people picture him always in Scotland fighting the English. What proof do we actually have that this even happened?
Well, it's like trying to put together a puzzle, just little bits of information here and there. But one big clue is this letter from King Philip V of France, written in 1300. He's writing to his guys in Rome, telling them to help Wallace out.
Hold on. So we have Wallace, the warrior, the rebel who stood up to England, and he might have actually met with the King of France, maybe even the Pope. That's incredible. This changes everything about how we see him. What was he hoping to get out of these meetings? Was it military help, money?
It's hard to say for sure, the details are still fuzzy. But it's safe to assume he was looking for something concrete. Maybe military support, like you said, maybe financial backing, or even just for them to officially recognize Scotland's right to be its own country. Whatever he wanted, the fact that he even went on this mission shows you how determined he was. This guy wasn't just a fighter hiding out in the woods. He was a leader, working on a global scale to take on a whole empire.
This whole European adventure, it's like a whole new side of Wallace, showing his ambition, how strategically he was thinking. But we know things couldn't stay peaceful forever. What brought him back to Scotland?
As much as he tried to get help from other countries, things in Scotland were getting worse. Edward I was tightening his grip, and they needed Wallace back home.
So he went back knowing it was
He
risky.
did. 1305, after years on the run, dodging English soldiers, trying to find allies for Scotland, William Wallace is betrayed and captured.
Bye.
Johnny Menteith, a Scottish knight, actually. Someone who had fought with Wallace at one point, but then he switched sides, swore loyalty to Edward I.
Talk about a blow. Betrayed by one of your own.
It's rough, especially for someone like Wallace, who had given everything, fought so hard for his country.
Do we know where he was captured? What happened?
It was near Glasgow, at a place called Robroyston. The details are kind of murky, but it seems like it was a well-planned ambush.
A sad ending for a guy who had managed to stay free for so long. What happened to Wallace after they caught him?
Well, the English knew they had their biggest enemy, so they didn't waste any time. They took Wallace to London. But not for a real trial, more like a big show, a way for Edward I to show everyone who was boss and hopefully break the Scottish people.
A show trial. Classic intimidation tactic.
Exactly. And this one was a big deal for another reason. It's one of the earliest examples we have of a war crimes trial.
Wow, war crimes back in the 1300s. That's fascinating. It makes you think about how our ideas about war have changed. Back then, was there even a right or wrong way to fight a war?
It shows you how complicated things were back then, legally and politically. Even then, people were starting to think about what was okay and not okay during a war, even if those rules were, applied pretty inconsistently. Anyway, the trial was at Westminster Hall, and they charged Wallace with treason against England.
Treason, even though Wallace always said he never promised to be loyal to Edward I in the first place.
Yep, that was his defense. He said he was fighting for Scotland, not betraying England. But like we said, this trial wasn't really about what was right or wrong. It was about making an example out of Wallace.
So the verdict was pretty much a given.
Yeah. Tragically, August 23rd, 1305, they find Wallace guilty. The sentence, the most brutal one they had, hanged, drawn, and quartered.
That's pretty awful. What did that even mean back then?
It was a public execution, meant to scare people as much as to punish. First, they hanged Wallace, but not all the way. While he was still alive, they cut him open. And then they cut his body into 4 pieces.
And to make absolutely sure everyone got the message, Edward I had those pieces put on display in cities all over England and Scotland.
Yep. His head was put on a spike on London Bridge as a warning to anyone else thinking of rebelling.
A brutal end to the life of a man who gave everything for Scotland's freedom.
It was. But here's the thing. Even though Edward tried to erase Wallace, to crush the Scottish people, he accidentally did the opposite.
He made Wallace a martyr.
Exactly. Wallace's story, people kept telling it, and he became a symbol of resistance. He gave the Scottish people something to believe in, something to fight for, and that's how he went from being just a warrior to a national hero.
And that brings us back to Braveheart. It might not be perfectly accurate, but it told Wallace's story to the whole world.
For sure. We always have to be careful with Hollywood, but Braveheart got one thing right. The heart of Wallace's story. It's about fighting for freedom, even when it seems impossible. The movie made people remember Wallace, made him famous all over again.
So even though Edward tried to make an example of Wallace, it backfired. He didn't destroy the Scottish spirit, he made it stronger.
It just goes to show you, sometimes the most powerful legacy comes from the toughest times.
Makes you think. Why do some historical figures stick with us for centuries? What makes someone like William Wallace more than just a name in a history book? What makes him an icon?
Maybe it's that they believed in something so strongly and never gave up.
Yeah.
Maybe it's that they were willing to fight for what they thought was right, even against impossible odds. Or maybe it's just that their stories, their struggles, their triumphs and tragedies, Those are things we can all relate to, even hundreds of years later. Whatever it is, their stories remind us that the human spirit, it's a powerful thing.
And sometimes that's all we need, a reminder that we can face our own battles, fight our own fights. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the life of William Wallace.